until we recognize that the reason we're in a mental health crisis is a condemnation about how we're living our lives these days. Like something in our society is not working. It's a lot of things. It's how we eat. It's how we interact. It's how much time we spend on our phones. It's what we value. And I think what psychedelics are really attuned to is helping us wake up to the narratives we've all been sold and embraced, and start to ask the questions about, does that narrative serve me? Can I start to shift it?
Welcome back to the Fitt Insider podcast. I'm your host, Joe Veneri. Today I'm joined by Ronan Levy, co-founder and CEO of Field Trip Health. In this episode, we discuss the company's approach to ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. Ronan details the key factors moving psychedelics into the mainstream, plus we explore use cases for mental health, depression, PTSD, and more. Let's get into it. Hi, Ronan. Welcome to Fitt Insider. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Great to be here. And I apologize in advance. You'll probably hear some screaming kids in the background. I keep trying to shut them up, but with no success.
No worries at all. Just kind of adds to the overall experience. Well, as we jump into it, I think, plenty to talk about, all types of interesting trends, a lot of what you're doing at Field Trip. But maybe for folks who aren't familiar, could you introduce yourself and tell us about Field Trip?
Sure. Yeah. I'm one of the co-founders of Field Trip. I now serve as chairman and CEO of Field Trip Health and Wellness Limited. We are leading the access equation when it comes to legal, safe psychedelic therapies. We've got 12 Field Trip Health centers across North America, including one in Europe in the Netherlands, primarily doing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, just given the whole legal regulatory regime. But in the Netherlands, we actually provide psilocybin-assisted therapy. And we've been at the forefront of this movement for, the last 4.5 years or so. And it's been amazing to have seen the evolution from where the world was just about 5 years ago to today. It's just really, really mind-blowing. And for good reason. These therapies transform lives. And I really do believe that there's a kernel of wisdom in psychedelics that can really, I think, transform how we live our lives in a really positive way.
Yeah, I think the space itself, and as you mentioned, in the last handful of years here, really coming onto the scene, I think, with the willingness to explore and accept, or at least, figure out a path to legalization, especially around mental health, trauma, and a host of other kind of ailments or benefits, right? Depending on how you think about it. I know your background a little bit, some experience, of course, as an entrepreneur and founder, but specifically in the kind of cannabis space. So seeing this evolution maybe once before of how we take something that was, stigmatized, criminalized, and now moving more into the mainstream. Do you think, or do you draw parallels between the cannabis industry and what's happening with psychedelics? And was that kind of a jumping off point to what you're doing now?
Yeah, certainly there's some parallels, but there are some differences. The high level parallels are obvious to classically stigmatized drugs, medicines, however you want to describe them, going from being once very verboten to being very mainstream, accepted and venerated in many ways. And the big difference in what we're seeing is cannabis and the eventual acceptance, both medical and adult use of cannabis, was driven grassroots. It was political activism. It was people who really liked cannabis, for either therapeutic or personal reasons, doesn't really matter, pushing the agenda. And slowly but surely it got traction as the world woke up and realized that the war on drugs and the criminal prohibition on cannabis was idiotic, for lack of a better term. Even so much so in Canada, we had essentially the Supreme Court declare that the criminal prohibition on access to cannabis was unconstitutional. Psychedelics, bit different. Psychedelics is research led. It's the research coming out of the Beckley Institute. It's the research coming out of Johns Hopkins. It's the research being conducted by MAPS. It's the phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials that are currently underway showing incredible safety, incredible efficacy that has really been driving the narrative around psychedelics. Now, psychedelics has the benefit of cannabis having done its evolution over the last couple of years, and everyone everyone's probably a little too broad, but a lot of people being like, oh, I thought that stuff was terrible. Turns out it's not so bad when it talks about cannabis. So we have a little bit of goodwill to build off of because what came from cannabis, but because the research is leading the conversation with psychedelics, it's such a much easier conversation. There's so many more politicians who are behind it, so many more scientists, and the data and the evidence is so much more persuasive that it's actually an easier conversation, even though psychedelics seem far more extreme in terms of how we think about what drugs are okay and which drugs are not okay. And so it's really cool to watch, seeing it happen and happening so quickly, to be quite honest.
Yeah, you're obviously on the inside and in many ways, as you said, like leading the charge with Field Trip. And from the outside looking in, trying to make sense of it and maybe drawing parallels, even if they are incomplete or, not the full picture with cannabis, with the research leading the way, it's like this, the research aspect, the kind of legalization aspect, and also the cultural aspect, so the acceptance and the interest. Can you kind of chalk it up to like why now, or the inflection point, or how that research that was happening and kind of fell off for a period of time, now there's the resurgence that is bringing it to the forefront once again? Or is it just kind of like a culmination that is kind of just serendipitous in a natural evolution?
I've never used this analogy before, but I'm going to use it. It's kind of like laser. It's like light amplified by the simultaneous emission of radiation in many ways. So what we have and why now is you have a mental health crisis that's of just incredible levels. 25% of Americans over 18 are going to be using antidepressants or equivalent at some point in their lives. These are just mind-blowing numbers. 1 in 4 people are going to experience a mental health issue at some point in their lives. So we're talking about billions and billions of people being affected with virtually no effective treatment options. And so you get this massive need. You've got cannabis changing attitudes towards drugs, generally speaking, and the whole war on drugs. One of my favorite memes coming out of the Biden election a couple of years ago was "Congratulations to the drugs for winning the war on drugs." And so you kind of you have the need, you have shifting attitudes, you have mental health coming into vogue. Now, I don't really like using the term mental health as it pertains to psychedelics or any of the dialogue, because it makes it sound like it's something about your head. And what we're seeing more and more is that what we think of as mental health is a holistic, health decision. It's what's going on in your head. It's what's going on in your gut. It's what you eat. It's how you exercise. It's how you live your life and all that kind of stuff. And when we talk about it as mental health, kind of restricting it to the brain, so it's not accurate, but we have this whole mental health thing happening and recategorizing how we think about that. You have Calm and Headspace achieving billion-dollar valuations, so it's kind of all mainstream right now. And then you have that running up into the current of the research, right? 5 years ago, MAPS was given breakthrough designation for its MDMA-assisted therapy studies from the FDA, which we would think would normally be fairly reticent to do anything with MDMA. You've got the research coming out of Johns Hopkins looking at psilocybin for all these different indications. And so all of these things are landing on an inflection point right now. And then you throw a pandemic, which messed with literally everybody's heads over the last 2.5 years. And it's kind of no surprise that psychedelics are very in vogue right now. But I think we're just we're just scratching the surface, to be quite honest. Like, I'm in this every day. You've been part of the conversation a bit now for a while. So it kind of seems like everybody knows what we're talking about. But the truth is, like, the other 97% of the population still thinks psychedelics are incredibly dangerous, that if you take LSD, you're going to go crazy and all this kind of stuff. So there's still a lot of work to do, but the amplitude of the conversation is definitely trending in the right way.
For sure. And to that point, like with the, moving this conversation more into the mainstream and, the vast majority of people, like you said, don't have this awareness and still have a perception of it that, it's super dangerous. And frankly, some people still have that of, cannabis. So it's kind of no surprise how much of this work is purely that education, destigmatization, resources, and how do you approach that almost, I don't know if it's both separate from, but also within the company itself. I don't know if you do you think of yourself as like, that's part of the mission? We have to drive this education and awareness, or do you feel like we have to be part of that broader conversation?
It's hard to dissect it, whether we're driving it or we have to be a part of it. I think we're driving it. If you look at the proportion of media mentions pertaining to psychedelics that include Field Trip. We account for about 40 to 50% of all media mentions as it pertains to psychedelic companies. So we're very much driving it, and something that's of a personal passion to me, which is, I think it's one of the things probably I've learned throughout life, but also saw in the cannabis industry, is that it can get over medicalized or over culturalized, if that's a word. And there's not a lot of nuance in between. And I think we have to have a really nuanced conversation. And nuance means that, as it pertains to psychedelics, it's not just about treatment-resistant depression. Or yesterday, Kathy Wood's fund came out with a big report saying this is a revolution in neuropharmacology. It is, and that's a completely incomplete answer. It's a cultural revolution. If we think of psychedelics just as a medical treatment, we're setting up to fail in terms of its impact. Yes, it will definitely have impact, but until we recognize that the reason we're in a mental health crisis is not a failure of psychiatry, it is partly a failure of psychiatry, but it's really a condemnation about how we're living our lives these days. Like, something in our society is not working. It's a lot of things. It's how we eat. It's how we interact. It's how much time we spend on our phones. It's what we value. I was raised on the neoliberal dream of go to school, work hard, get good grades, get the job, marry the beautiful woman, buy the car, buy the house, and your life is perfect. And I've been fortunate that I did all of that. And lo and behold, my life still isn't perfect. And I've got all sorts of, things I got to work through. Nothing that leads to treatment-resistant depression or severe anxiety. But it's part of life, and I think what psychedelics are really attuned to is helping us wake up to the narratives we've all been sold and embraced, and start to ask the questions about, does that narrative serve me? Can I start to shift it? And that's the most important part of this conversation. It's not about the drug. It's not about the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor that gets agonized by psilocybin. It's about waking up to what's going on in our lives. And so you either have, the doctors saying it's all about the receptor binding, and then you have, the hippies being about, it's all about God and the spirit. And the answer is, it's all of that and more. And so I take it personally, and I've really tried to help position Field Trip as the company that says, yes, it's all of this. And now let's have a very open, flowing dialogue where all of these can be part of the equation. And I think that's where we're really going to move it. And that's why we've taken that upon ourselves as part of our role as Field Trip.
Yeah, I really appreciate the kind of nuance that you share there, because I do think oftentimes it's described as almost binary, right? That it's a kind of healthcare, mental health solution, or it's, just a pure recreational pursuit, and where and how those things overlap, I think is part of that, what we're still trying to figure out, frankly, and how we do that in a way that we can introduce it to society to avoid. And maybe you have a perspective on this, like just the idea that it is just free flowing, and you can walk into like you do a cannabis store and grab it and go on your way and experience however you want to. When you talk about something where the experience itself, the therapy, the coaching, how it's administered is such a big part of that. How do you bridge those two worlds to avoid this, for lack of a better word, kind of like free for all access versus like this controlled and kind of nuanced, back to your point, experience?
I'm a lawyer by training. I'm still qualified, actually. And one of the things I've come to learn as a practicing lawyer is that regulation is a really blunt instrument. And whatever you try to regulate, people are going to get around it, and you're going to create unintended side effects. And it just becomes, and that's why we have tax acts that are like this long, and securities acts that are this long, criminal codes that are this long, is because, for every regulation, we've got to create 10 new regulations to try and fix the problem we started with the first one. And so I'm actually kind of a believer that a free-for-all approach is probably the best way, which is we still need the research. And the research is important because that leads to drug identification numbers, FDA approvals, insurance coverage, and access for people who, are in desperate need for it. At the same time, people like myself, it's like I'm educated, I'm informed, I'm experienced. I probably know what I'm doing more so than any regulator is going to have an opinion, or any doctor who's advising a regulator is going to have an opinion. And so let's kind of let it see how it plays out and learn. I mean, this is design thinking, right? You put it out there, you see what happens, you evolve. instead of trying to regulate for every potential harm or risk, which is what often tends to happen. Let's be responsive. Let's let people be responsible, take responsibility for their own actions, and evolve that way. Are there going to be unintended consequences? Absolutely. Are people going to get hurt? Probably. Is that I'm not going to even say sacrifice. Is that a decision I'm willing to make? Yes, because everything has consequences. And I see it so often in social media where people are like, if you believe that progress should still happen, notwithstanding that there was some incident you described as callous. And it's like part of the conversation, and this goes back to the conversation about nuance, is like, I can be for progress and want to keep moving forward and still have empathy and sympathy for the things that went wrong and hold them at the same time. But most people think it's impossible. You're either a callous capitalist or you're not. And it's like, no, you can be a compassionate person and a capitalist at the same time. And they go hand in hand. And truthfully, until we accept that both of those can coexist, we're going to keep running into problems over and over again. I know that's a long, kind of diverted way of answering the question, but it's like, I do believe we should, experiment and learn instead of trying to over anticipate every potential consequence.
No, I appreciate the insight and kind of framing that up. And I think that at this point, at least, not a right answer, or certainly not a known answer in terms of how it's going to play out. So being willing to, and, taking the, if you want to call them chances, right? Or just exploring how we best implement this. I think it's at this point feels inevitable that it's going to happen. So it's just a matter of how it plays out. And along the way, right, we can't necessarily predict every outcome. And kind of to that point, we've talked about it at a high level, just the overall kind of shift in psychedelics more broadly. But I definitely want to tie it into what you're actually doing at Field Trip, and how you've, from identifying that this shift was coming to saying, hey, this is what we're able to start with and, implement at this point. And this is where we kind of see it going. So maybe just start with, what is the experience today when somebody kind of walks into a clinic or accesses Field Trip, and how is that growing or doing as a business?
Yeah, sure. So what we've done with Field Trip is, as I'm sure is evident in this conversation, tried to blend the best of all worlds into a single experience. And so we're very medically rigorous, and there's a physician on site, and you go through a psychiatric screening just to make sure ketamine-assisted therapy is appropriate for you. On site, when you come into our clinic, there's medical staff, there's therapists, there's just about everything you would think you would want in sort of a very Western medical context of like a professional who's trained to deal with any circumstance in this kind of sphere we have on site. On the other hand, you walk into our clinic and it looks nothing like a clinic. It looks like a bohemian chic apartment. A lot of people opine that they'd like to live in our clinics because they're nicer than their apartments. And we invested very heavily in that because we wanted to breed a sense of comfort and safety, and trust, so people are at ease when they're dealing with us any step of the way, which is contrary to most doctors' offices, if you think about it, right? They're very efficiency, fluorescent lights, fast space, frenetic, that's not the kind of experience we have. We have always strived to have a one woo factor. So we're not woo woo, but we're one woo, which is like we're paying homage to a lot of the ceremonial and indigenous traditions that came before, without leaning into it too much. We have a no shaman rule. There's no shamans at Field Trip, right? Because again, we want to position this in a way that opens it up to a lot of people in our Western society who are probably somewhat skeptical, not necessarily wrongfully so, of things that are a little too out there in terms of ceremonial practice or non-rigorous science. And so when you come, the process is you start with, getting whatever information you need from our staff. We do a psychiatric screening to make sure our therapies are appropriate for you. Assuming everything's a go, you come in, you meet with your therapeutic team, you get comfort with them, you come in for your first session a few days later. And what really differentiates us from most operators out there is that we have a heavy focus on integration. So after every 2 ketamine sessions, there's a purely dedicated integration session. So all the insights and awareness that come out of the experiences, there's an opportunity to embrace them and embed them into your life. There's an opportunity to take advantage of that window of neuroplasticity to adopt new habits, new practices, new outlooks, new mindsets, and really have them crystallize. And that's roughly the experience of Field Trip. Is it's a very professional but very friendly and deeply focused on integration experience. And it's generating, as far as I'm aware, the best outcomes when it comes to depression and anxiety treatments anywhere in the world. On average, we see our clients go from severe depression and anxiety scores to mild depression and anxiety scores. And those benefits often last for 4 months or longer. We're just finalizing some research that we're doing internally, so I can't talk about too much in the ways of details because we want to get it published. But what we're seeing now is even that 4 month improvement may actually be longer with significant effect size. So it really is quite impressive.
Yeah, it's kind of not only standardizing in a way, but also branding the whole experience is much more appealing and something that you want to participate in as opposed to going to the doctor's office, which is the complete opposite of that.
100%. Yep.
And then to this point, you mentioned kind of like the 4 month mark and maybe even more. Is there a kind of recommendation in terms of number of sessions or a limit to the number of sessions, at least for what we know to this point?
Yeah, so the results we're seeing typically involve 6 ketamine sessions interspersed with 3 integration sessions delivered over the course of 3 to 4 weeks. And so that's generating the best outcomes, but we recognize that that's very time intensive and it's not inexpensive either. And so we can accommodate and adjust those programs as, with a good degree of flexibility. On average, we don't recommend anyone do less than 4 sessions. You can, but you won't see the results I think you're hoping to see. When you get up to 4 and then up to 6, you generate really, really incredible results.
And then in terms of access or legalization, is it a state by state issue at this point? Is it limited as far as where you're able to roll this out and how do you see that kind of expanding?
No, actually, we can do it everywhere. So many people, it comes as a surprise to many people, but ketamine is an FDA-approved medicine. It was initially approved, I think, somewhere around 1970 as an anesthetic, and it's still used in hospitals. In fact, it's so safe and so frequently used that if you have children and they break a bone or dislocate a shoulder or whatever, and you take them to the ER, odds are they'll get ketamine over any other form of anesthetic. That's the kind of safety profile we're dealing with. And because it's an FDA approved medicine, as long as you have a doctor with a DEA license, they can prescribe. And that goes across all 50 states, probably, the other territories as well, but we haven't expanded that far yet. And so there's no restrictions on that. Psilocybin that we do in the Netherlands, obviously we can only do that in the Netherlands right now. We could conceivably do it in Jamaica, and there's a couple of other jurisdictions where psilocybin mushrooms are legal. We're not there yet. But in the lower 48, ketamine-assisted therapy is available anywhere. There has to be a medical diagnosis. So you can't walk in and just be like, hey, I'm feeling great. I've got no issues. I just want to get high. That's not going to pass our medical muster. But the truth is like, if you're not dealing with some kind of adjustment issues over the last 2.5 years, you're probably not paying attention. So there's usually basis to treat a lot of people because everybody's got stuff to work through.
And then in terms of, and you may have mentioned this, so apologies, but how many locations are there now? And I guess how many do you envision rolling out even in the near term?
Yeah, right now there are 12 locations, 8 in the US, 3 in Canada, and 1 in the Netherlands. Right now we're focused on just operating the existing infrastructure, but we've also recently launched Field Trip at Home, which is ketamine therapy from the comfort of your home. What we're seeing is that there's certain people who want the comfort and experience of doing this in a center specifically designed for psychedelic therapies. And there are a lot more people who don't live within 20 miles of any of our clinics or prefer the comfort of doing it from their home. And so we launched our Field Trip at Home program to deliver it there. And so our focus right now is, up to this point, we've been trying to prove this can be done safely, effectively, generate great results, and there's demand for it. We feel we've satisfied, those objectives. Now it's about scale and access. And so going forward, we're going to be focusing on Field Trip at Home. We've got our app Trip, which is out there, which is designed to support the experience, whether you're doing it on your own, legally or otherwise, with meditations, music, protocols, all that kind of stuff. And so we're going to focus more on, there's a huge medical need, but clearly the cultural movement is moving a lot faster than the medical establishment is around this. And again, we really think it's important to try and set a narrative and a discourse around any psychedelic use, whether medical and therapeutic or totally recreational, such that people are informed and thoughtful and responsible about how they do this kind of stuff. And so that's going to become a much more central focus of Field Trip. providing people with the tools, providing people where access where medically appropriate, and then also providing people with the spaces if that's of importance to the individual at the time.
Yeah, and we talked about how, especially during the pandemic, you are encountering a lot of these mental health or otherwise kind of issues in your life face to face. Certainly, telemedicine from a outcome of the pandemic, a lot of people now realizing that, hey, we can do much more of these things at home. So I think that also kind of accelerating this shift to the at home ketamine treatment. When you talk about now expanding access, you have the clinics, you have the app, you have the at home treatment. What happens next, right? Is both, is it a partially a waiting game as other drugs become destigmatized? Is it, hey, what other services can we launch, whether that's in person or at home or digitally? How do you think about navigating that path while things still have to play out, right, at the kind of legal level?
The answer is yes to all of those, to be quite honest. So, we haven't put much effort into building awareness for our app and the digital tools that we've built. Same with our at-home program, which only launched, about 2 months ago, and it really was a beta program to see what the response and demand was, and the response to both have been fantastic. And so, really, now it's about pouring fuel on the fire to create awareness for those and really create engagement with them. Whereas before, we're just kind of letting them grow organically. So that's one focus. Another focus is expanding the funnel. So primarily, we treat people with depression, anxiety, and PTSD these days. We're looking very actively at expanding to other indications. So alcohol use disorder. There was just a great study that came out on psilocybin for alcohol use disorder. Ketamine is actually very effective as well. Other studies have shown that. So looking to expand who we can help and for what indications is going to be part of the conversation. And then importantly, gearing up for MDMA. MAPS expects approval for MDMA-assisted therapy from the FDA sometime late next year, early 2024. Even though that seems like far away at the when you get to my age, that's going to be here like that. And so it's going to take time to gear up and get prepared and develop our SOPs and make sure our clinics are designed and structured to support MDMA-assisted therapy. And we have a great relationship with MAPS. I think they certainly look at us as the forefront in terms of their commercialization strategy as well. So all of those are going to be the focus over the next 18 months or so.
Yeah, it's an exciting time, I think, as we think about, you mentioned, a year or two, that's, a blink of an eye. And so I think laying that groundwork, continuing to do the work that you're doing. As we get towards the end of the conversation, one thing that I think would be interesting to get your perspective on, and maybe this isn't the case with psychedelics, but as we've kind of seen with cannabis, bringing that full circle almost to where we started the conversation, how much of the experience can a brand own, if that's the right word, from creating their own strands, right? And having their own pipes or, packaging or clothing or extensions of the brand that way, as well as like the physical locations themselves where they're selling these, all the different types of, whether it's the drugs themselves or paraphernalia, everything that goes along with it. And almost to the extent where it becomes a lifestyle brand. And you've talked about, thinking of this as, hey, we want to break down as many walls as possible. Is it important, or how important is it to think about how we can extend or expand the brand as we do this to kind of control or own that experience versus building a platform and making it accessible and it serves its purpose that way? I think, is it possible, or is it even right for somebody to kind of own ketamine treatment or psilocybin or that experience, or should it be kind of more accessible and approachable and democratized almost?
I think it should be democratized, and I don't think anybody, at least within Field Trip, certainly I don't want to own the experience. You mentioned at the beginning of the question how these brands, these cannabis companies, have extended into lifestyle brands. And I think that's absolutely critical for the psychedelic industry, because it is lifestyle that we're talking about. It's the lifestyle that we all lead that has led to the mental health crisis. And that's to say, like, psychedelics are kind of like the catalyst to shift the lifestyle. So if you kind of just crack the egg, but don't have a bowl to drop it into, you're doing people a bit of a disservice. Now, a lot of people can be responsible and being like, okay, my eyes have been opened. Now I can make the shift on my own. But I think it's important, and certainly I feel passionate about being like, okay, now your eyes have opened. You started the trend towards healing, or however you may want to describe it. how do you support that? How do you sustain that? And so at Field Trip, we're trying to build an ecosystem, not necessarily to be exclusive, but because it is synergistic, right? You go through our ketamine or psilocybin assisted therapy experiences, you're done. Now what? Do you just go back to regular life? Do you surround yourself with all the friends that kind of made you miserable in the first place? Do you go back to the job you hate? Or do you find a community of people that you can now share your experiences with? And when a new insight pops up three months from now, and all of your friends think you're crazy because you went to do ketamine assisted therapy, is there a network of people you can now turn to, who understand it and be like, oh, that's really interesting, Joe. I had a similar experience. Here's what I took away from that. That may help you. Like, oh, by the way, next week we're going to Othership, in Toronto to do some sauna and cold plunges and a breathwork session. You want to come? It's like all of that matters. So if you're not creating at least the off ramps, or more accurately, the on ramps to these other experiences, psychedelics aren't going to achieve what I think they could achieve, and a field trip won't be doing as much as it could be. So I don't think that's owning it. It doesn't stop anybody else from doing something similar. What we're focused on is creating these opportunities and then tracking people and showing that, hey, when you do this and this and this, and we've curated what we think is the best experience, you generate these outcomes and your life is this much better. That will stand by itself. And that doesn't involve IP or anything along those lines. That's just creating customer delight and making people's lives better. And if there's anything that business should be doing, it should be that, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it's a huge opportunity. And obviously you put it much more succinctly than my question from the onset, but that, facilitating that community and providing those points of intersection and continuing to, push that forward. I think, frankly, not being discussed a ton, right, from the outside looking in, but a massive opportunity to drive this forward and play a role in, whether it's destigmatizing or normalizing the conversation around these types of experiences and this culture and, the people that are choosing to pursue it. And I think, in wrapping up, maybe just one more question. You may have touched on this as we think about, MDMA and what comes after that, but is there anything that we should look out for, anything that you're particularly excited about from the business or even if it's no announcements that you can reveal, anything we should be keeping tabs on?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we're working hard to really expand the functionality and improve the content of the Trip app. So, I think in the coming weeks and coming months, you'll see some announcements coming out around that that I think are just going to enhance it as a fantastic tool. We've got some innovative programs in the works that will leverage off the refreshed app experience. Can't share too many details about that, but I think it's really exciting stuff. And it all speaks to what I've been saying, which is this is a lifestyle decision. And so it starts with the treatment protocol, but that's just the first step. The rest of it is where I think the real magic can happen. And so you'll see a lot more of that conversation and a lot more work from Field Trip in that respect.
Perfect. A lot to look forward to, and we'll get you out of here on this. Where should people learn more? What's the best kind of access point or starting point?
Yeah, fieldtriphealth.com is our website. On socials, it's at fieldtriphealth. If you want to follow me, I'm at Ronan D as in David Levy, Levy. Personally, I mean, obviously it pertains to Field Trip, but we've got some fun stuff coming out. I just published a book called The Trip Journal. So if you're doing psychedelics or meditation or anything along those lines, it's really a guided tool, much like the 5-minute journal. I'm sure many people who listen to this are familiar with the 5-minute journal, to help you journal your experiences and start the integration process. So that's coming out. We've got a documentary coming out probably sometime toward the end of this year called Ordinary Trip, where I basically put myself through a whole bunch of experiences and see what happens. And I think that's going to be really fantastic. And then next year, I got a book called The Ketamine Breakthrough coming out with Dr. Mike Dow. So lots of fun stuff coming out personally and for the company.
Yeah, making moves. It's awesome to see it. We're certainly excited about it and share this out. Excited to share the conversation and encourage folks to check it out. So I appreciate you making some time today and sharing your insights.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Joe.